The snow hadn't quite melted from the ridge. Winter was loosening its grip, but the bones of the land still remembered the cold. Silas Granger stood alone under a slate-gray sky, his coat drawn tight against the chill. Before him, fresh dirt mounded over a small grave, the last one he'd dig, or so he told himself. The storm clouds gathering on the horizon weren't just in the heavens. He didn't speak. What was there to say? The wind howled through the pine trees as if mourning for him. His wife and daughter had gone quick, a fever that came in the night and took both by sunrise. No prayers had slowed it. No whiskey had dulled the pain. Just silence now. An empty cabin behind him, a horse with a limp in the barn, and no one to talk to but the ghost. He turned from the grave and started back toward the cabin, shovel still in hand. The wind picked up, driving sleet across his face like spit from a cruel god. When he opened the cabin door, the fire inside had nearly gone out. He tossed on more wood and stood over it, watching the smoke curl into the rafters. One more storm was rolling in. Then came the knock. It was soft at first, like a branch scratching at the door. Silas didn't move. Nobody knocked out here. If they were friendly, they called out. If they weren't, they didn't knock at all. The knock came again, 2 slow taps, a pause, then a third. Rhythmic. Desperate. He stepped to the side, took his rifle from above the hearth, and eased the door open with the barrel. What stood there nearly undid him. A woman, barefoot, soaked to the bone, her eyes hollow and sunken. She clutched something against her chest, a bundle of rags. Then he saw them, 3 small children, barely walking, leaning into her legs. The little one coughed so hard he staggered. The other 2 didn't speak, just stared up at Silas with the wide-eyed silence of those who'd seen too much. Please," she whispered. "They haven't eaten in 2 days." Silas said nothing. Just looked past her, eyes searching the trees for movement. A trick? Bait? He'd seen worse. Seen folks use children like lures. But the wind screamed and the snow whipped, and something in the woman's stance told him she'd stopped walking only because she couldn't go another step. He stepped back. She didn't thank him. Just stumbled through the door, dropped to her knees near the fire. The children clung to her, shivering. Silas bolted the door, rifle still in hand, eyes locked on the woman. She unwrapped the rags slowly, revealing not valuables, but starvation. Bones. Ribs showing through worn shirts. Faces sunburned and frostbitten all at once. "Sit there," he said gruffly. He pulled a threadbare blanket from a chest and tossed it near the fire. She took it without a word. For the next several minutes, nothing was said. The wind raged outside, beating the walls. The flames flickered, casting dancing shadows. Silas moved with purpose, put a kettle over the fire, added what was left of his root stew, and pulled down a bit of dried venison he'd been saving. They needed it more. The woman tried to feed the children first, crumbling the meat with shaking fingers. One refused to eat, too weak. She held him and hummed something wordless, something sad. Silas stirred the pot. "What's your name?" he finally asked, his voice low. "Mira." He nodded once. "And them?" She hesitated. "Sammy, Clara, and Luke." "There." Her voice broke, and she didn't finish the sentence. Silas didn't ask more. Names were enough for now. That night, he didn't sleep. Sat in a chair with his rifle across his lap, watching the fire burn low. Mira curled with the children in a corner, the blanket pulled tight. Every now and then, one of the kids whimpered in their sleep. Once, Mira sat up suddenly, eyes wild, but calmed when she saw the fire. She laid back down. By morning, the storm had deepened. Snow draped over the window like a shroud. Silas stepped outside briefly to check the woodpile. In the distance, wolf tracks meandered through the tree line. He brought in more wood, stoked the fire, and made more broth. They were going to be stuck for a while. Over the next 2 days, Mira spoke little. She moved with quiet resolve, always tending to the children, always watchful. Silas noticed the way her hands trembled when she sat still too long. He offered her coffee once, what little was left, and she refused, eyes on the children. When Clara developed a cough, Mira wrapped her in rags and held her near the fire for hours, whispering things Silas couldn't hear. He watched them, something heavy stirring in his chest. His daughter had coughed like that once. Same kind of winter. Same kind of silence. On the third morning, Mira tried to leave. I shouldn't stay. You've done enough. Silas looked at her, at the children huddled in the corner. Snow still fell in slow sheets beyond the window. You step outside with them now, they won't last the day. She stood still for a long time, eyes wet. I don't want trouble, she said. You already brought it. The words came out harder than he meant. She flinched and he regretted it. But it was true. The moment she walked through his door, his life stopped being simple. Not that it had been simple to begin with. Later that evening, Mira finally spoke more. Told him in halting words how she'd been traveling with a group of settlers, how they'd been turned away from one homestead after another. Her husband had died in the early days, coughing blood. The group split. She'd kept walking. I thought I could make it to the river town, she said. Thought someone there might help. Silas poked at the fire. Nobody helps for free anymore. She didn't argue. That night, Silas lay down on the floor, closer to the fire than usual. The children slept against Myra's side. He stared at the ceiling, listening to the wind, to the rhythmic breathing of the triplets. In the dark, Myra's voice came soft. You lost someone, didn't you? He didn't answer. I saw the grave, she said gently. When we came up the path. He rolled over. Best not to talk about things that can't be changed. Maybe not, she said. But I think you're the kind of man who still remembers her laugh. He didn't know what to say to that. So he said nothing. The next morning, the snow began to break. Melted into thick slush along the trail. Silas stepped outside, breathing in the cold, clean air. For the first time in weeks, he felt the ache in his chest loosen, just a little. He looked back through the doorway. Mira was feeding the children. Luke smiled, missing a tooth, and Mira wiped his chin with practiced tenderness. The cabin, once silent and hollow, now echoed faintly with life. Silas leaned on the post, jaw tight. He still didn't know who she truly was, or where she'd come from. Still didn't trust that trouble wasn't right behind her. But something had shifted. He no longer felt like the last man alive. And that frightened him more than the storm ever had. Silas had lived on the edge of the wilderness long enough to know peace was never permanent. As the thaw continued, the days grew longer and the roads more passable, which meant isolation's brief shelter was ending. By the time the first wagon tracks etched themselves into the muddy trail near his land, Silas had built a routine with Mira and the children that felt both fragile and strange, like a dream he knew would vanish at dawn. The children recovered quickly, at least in body. Sammy took to shadowing Silas around the homestead, mimicking his every move. He'd carry chopped kindling in his tiny arms, proud of every bundle stacked by the stove. Luke, the quietest, often sat by the window, staring out at the pines, as if waiting for someone. Clara clung to Mira constantly, though she smiled more now, her face no longer sunken with hunger. Mira worked with a quiet efficiency that matched Silas's. She'd found his garden tools, and without being asked, began preparing the soil. By late spring, neat rows of onions, beans, and potatoes stretched behind the cabin. Her movements were precise, her hands always busy, but her eyes stayed cautious, as though expecting the earth beneath her feet to shift. One afternoon, Silas found her mending his old coat on the porch. The needle moved steadily in her hand, thread weaving in and out like a heartbeat. He stood for a moment, watching, uncertain whether to thank her or leave her to it. "Was your husband a rancher?" he asked finally. She didn't look up. "Blacksmith." He nodded. "Good trade. He made our wedding bands from iron and silver. Said we'd last longer than gold." Silas swallowed hard. He hadn't worn his ring in years, but it still hung on a leather cord inside his shirt. "They killed him for his tools," she added, her voice low. "Left me and the children to starve." Silas didn't ask who they were. He'd heard enough tales in the last few years. Outlaws, deserters, desperate men with no flags left to serve. After the war, law had thinned in the West like hair on an old man's head. Civilization didn't reach far, and when it did, it came with guns. A few days later, Silas noticed signs near the trail. Boot prints. Fresh ones, deep in the softened mud. He crouched beside them, his brow furrowed. There were 3 sets, moving slow. One man had a limp. He followed the tracks for half a mile before they vanished near the river bend, where a makeshift camp had been cleared. He returned to the cabin in silence, unease thick in his chest. That night, as the children slept, Silas sat by the fire and loaded his rifle. Mira watched from across the room, her eyes catching the flicker of the flame. "You saw something," she said. "Don't know who they are. Don't like not knowing. Could be travelers. Could be worse." She nodded slowly. Then, with a resolve that surprised him, she walked to the table, pulled out a hidden knife from beneath her bundle of clothes, and set it beside him. "I won't let them take my children," she said. He looked at the knife, then at her, and for the first time, saw not just a survivor, but someone who'd fought already, maybe more than he ever had. "They might not come here," he offered. "They always do," she whispered. In the days that followed, they prepared. Silas reinforced the barn door, and checked the old traps in the hills. Mira taught the children to hide in a false wall she'd built in the cabin, just large enough for all 3 if danger came quick. She moved like someone who'd lived on the run before. Not reckless, strategic. On the 3rd evening, the wind brought the scent of smoke. Silas spotted it at dusk. A thin, oily column rising between the trees. Not his smoke. Not nearby. But deliberate. A signal or a camp. He returned, jaw clenched. Mira saw the change in his eyes. "How long do we have?" she asked. "Maybe till morning." She didn't panic. Just pulled the children close and whispered into their ears. At dawn, the sound of hooves broke the quiet. 3 riders, silhouettes against the pale horizon. They approached slow, weapons slung casual, but their posture said everything. They weren't neighbors. One called out, "Ho there! We're looking for a woman and her brats. You seen anyone pass through?" Silas stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. "Ain't seen no one." The man chuckled, dismounting. He was lean, ragged, with a crooked jaw and eyes too bright. "Funny. We tracked prints right to this trail." Silas didn't flinch. Trails run both ways. The second man, bulkier and darker, shifted in his saddle. "He's lying. I smell stew." Silas cocked the rifle. "That ain't all you'll smell if you take one more step." The third man, silent until now, raised his hand slightly. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves. You mind if we look around?" "I do," Silas said evenly. "My land. My say." The crooked-jawed one smiled. "Well, now you've made it personal." Everything happened fast. The bulky man drew his pistol. Silas fired. The man screamed, falling from his horse, blood blooming on his thigh. Mira, from the cabin window, shot once, clean and hard. The silent man fell backwards, dead before he hit the ground. Only the leader remained. He backed up, eyes wide. "This ain't over," he hissed, mounting his horse. Silas lowered the rifle but didn't fire. "It is for you." The man turned and rode hard into the trees. For several minutes, the clearing was still. The children didn't cry, they didn't even peek out. Mira stood just inside the cabin, rifle smoking, her eyes locked on Silas. He nodded once. She nodded back. They buried the body in the woods. Silas said nothing over the grave. He didn't believe in last words for men who brought death. That night, they sat close to the fire. Mira cradled Luke, who had wet himself during the shooting. Sammy leaned against Silas, small fingers clutching his shirt. Clara held Myra's hand so tight her knuckles turned white. "You could have let us go," Mira said softly. "Would have made your life easier." Silas didn't answer right away. He looked around the room, the patched walls, the worn table, the half-mended coat by the door. then at the children, then at Mira. "Life hasn't been easy in a long time," he said. "But this feels right." Mira looked away, blinking quickly. The fire cracked. Outside, the wind carried away the last of the smoke. And in the silence, something unspoken settled between them. Not quite love, but the shape of it. The beginning. The seasons shifted again, as they always did, slowly and without permission. By late summer, the once charred earth had grown green again. Crops poked defiantly through the soil Mira had tilled with her bare hands, and the cabin, long a place of silence and survival, now echoed with laughter, quiet, unsure at first, but laughter nonetheless. Silas found himself listening for it more and more. Not long ago, he had lived by the rhythms of solitude, the creak of aging wood, the howl of a distant wolf, the thud of axe on bark. But now, new rhythms had settled in, Sammy's quick feet, Clara's singing to the hens, Luke's cautious stories whispered under the blanket of night. Even Myra's footsteps had become a comfort, soft and steady, like the sound of rain after drought. Yet peace was never guaranteed in places like these. Silas noticed the first signs in town, strangers with too much coin and too little conscience. Mira had come with him that day to trade surplus beans and eggs. She rarely left the cabin, but insisted on helping. She kept her head down at the general store, but Silas noticed the glances. A tall man in a gray vest leaned against the post outside, his boots too clean, his questions too casual. "New folks up your way?" he asked Silas, fiddling with a silver coin. "Just me and the trees," Silas replied without looking at him. The man smiled, slow and knowing. "Trees don't grow gardens like yours." Silas didn't answer. Mira stayed close behind him the entire ride home. That night they sat in the field behind the barn. The stars were fierce and bright, spread across the sky like spilled salt. Mira wrapped her arms around herself, even though the air was warm. "They're looking for us again," she murmured. "They won't find you," Silas said. She didn't respond right away. "Then, why do you keep us here? You could have sent us on when the snow melted. You owe us nothing." Silas reached down and pulled a blade of grass from the ground, twisted it between his fingers. "I lost everything, wife, child. I didn't think anything good could grow again." He looked at her then, at the shadows on her face, at the weariness behind her eyes. "You didn't grow in spite of the storm," he added. "You grew because of it. And so did they." Her breath caught just once. She looked away, but not before he saw the faint shimmer of tears. For a brief span of weeks, things settled again. The children helped with harvest. Mira preserved what she could, filling jars with peaches and stewed tomatoes. Silas began building a second structure near the edge of the clearing, a schoolroom, maybe, or something like it. He never said what it was for, but the children guessed and giggled and brought him nails from the bucket when he wasn't looking. Then came the fire. It started deep in the woods, far to the east, but the smoke carried ahead of it, thick and acrid. Silas smelled it first, his body recognizing danger even before his mind did. By evening, the orange glow lit the horizon, and the wind screamed through the trees like a warning. Mira moved quickly, packing what they could carry. Luke held Clara's hand, and Sammy didn't ask questions, just helped. Silas grabbed the rifles, a satchel of coins, and what dried food they had left. They rode out at midnight, all 5 of them on the 2 mules, leaving the cabin behind. They made it to the river by dawn. The fire hadn't reached this far yet, but the smoke had, curling like ghost fingers around the rocks and branches. Silas found them shelter beneath a rocky outcrop. Mira soaked cloth in river water and pressed it to the children's faces. No one spoke much. There was nothing to say. By the 3rd day, the fire had passed, but not without leaving its mark. When they returned, the cabin still stood, blackened and smoking, its windows shattered, but intact. The barn was gone. The garden scorched. Everything smelled of ash. Silas stood in the middle of the yard, staring at the ruins. Mira joined him silently. The children remained near the tree line, watching, unsure if they should approach. It can be rebuilt, Mira said softly. Silas nodded, but he didn't move. Then came the sound of hooves. 3 riders again, different this time, but dressed like the others. Guns at their sides, eyes sharp. The man in the gray vest led them. He smiled when he saw Mira. Told you I'd find you, he said. Price on your head's worth burning half this valley. Silas stepped in front of her. You'll have to go through me. The man laughed. That was the idea. Gunfire shattered the silence. Silas fired first. One of the men fell, his scream cut off as he tumbled from his saddle. Mira grabbed the second rifle and dropped to her knee, firing clean into the chest of the second. The gray-vested man returned fire, the bullet grazing Silas's side. Blood poured fast, but Silas stayed upright. Mira didn't flinch, she moved toward him, handing him her weapon. I've got the kids, she said. He nodded, took aim, and fired once more. The man in gray dropped. This time there was no laughter. Mira tied a strip of cloth around Silas's waist, her hands shaking. He grunted, pain blooming sharp behind his ribs. You're not dying, she muttered fiercely. Not now. He chuckled, then winced. Didn't plan to. They buried the bodies far from the cabin. Mira took a match and burned what remained of the barn, cleansing it of death. The children helped gather stones for a new well. Clara found a scorched rag doll in the ash and washed it carefully in the stream. Weeks passed. The schoolroom was never finished, but the cabin rose again, stronger this time, with a new roof and thick walls. Silas built 3 small beds in the loft and let the children choose which was theirs. He gave Mira the bedroom and slept by the fire, until one night she came to him and took his hand, saying nothing. By winter, the land was quiet once more. Silas stood at the edge of the property, watching the horizon. Mira joined him, a shawl around her shoulders. Still expecting trouble? She asked. Always, he said. Then added, but not tonight. Behind them, Sammy was teaching Luke how to swing an axe. Clara chased chickens through the frost. A home, not just a shelter. Mira leaned against him. You saved us. He shook his head. You saved me first. She smiled, small and slow. And in the cold, under a bruised sky, they watched the world turn gently forward, wounded, yes, but still standing. Still theirs. Spring returned with cautious footsteps, the snow reluctant to leave, the soil still stiff with memory. But shoots of green curled from beneath the frost, and birdsong once more broke the silence of dawn. The fire-scarred cabin now bore signs of hope, mended walls, fresh beams, and children's voices filtering through every crevice. Life, stubborn as ever, refused to retreat. Silas moved slower now. His wound had healed unevenly, pulling tight with every movement. But he refused rest. Each morning, he was up before the light, tending fences, feeding livestock, teaching Luke how to sharpen a blade, Sammy how to read a trail, and Clara how to be still enough for the birds to trust her. He didn't say it, but they were becoming his reasons. Their growth, their laughter, the quiet way they watched him for approval. It gave him something the wilderness never had, a purpose beyond surviving. Mira was different too. She moved like someone who no longer expected to run. Her hands were always busy, kneading bread, stitching worn clothes, teaching Clara to string beads or Sammy to spell. At night, she'd sit beside the fire and read aloud whatever Silas could find in town, a Bible, a ledger, a water-stained almanac. Her voice was soft but steady, like the wind through tall grass. When she paused, Silas would finish her sentences, their thoughts weaving tighter with every page. Still, no one dared say what they all felt, that this, whatever it was, had become home. Trouble, though, never disappeared, it only waited. One evening, while Silas bartered in town, he overheard hushed voices behind the blacksmith's shop. A name slipped through the shadows, Mira. His muscles tensed. She's still alive, that woman, one said. Price is high for her. Dead or alive. They say she killed a man, the other whispered. Left him in the fire, came the reply. Silas gripped the hilt of his knife, but didn't reveal himself. Instead, he rode back with urgency burning in his veins. That night, he sharpened all the tools and brought the rifle inside. Mira noticed but didn't ask. She simply placed a hand on his arm, and for a moment, he considered telling her what he'd heard. But he didn't. Not yet. 2 weeks passed without incident. Then, near dusk, Clara ran into the cabin, eyes wide with fear. "Riders," she gasped. "Down by the creek." Silas grabbed the rifle and looked at Mira. She was already packing food into a sack, her face pale but resolute. "They're not going to stop, are they?" she asked. He shook his head. "Then we don't run," she said. "Not this time." He looked at her, really looked, at the mother who had endured hunger, fire, and fear, at the woman who had buried her past in scorched soil and dared to bloom again. She wasn't running anymore. So they set the plan in motion. Silas stationed Luke and Sammy in the barn loft with pebbles to throw as warning. Clara stayed with Mira inside. The door was barred, windows reinforced. Silas took position near the tree line, hidden by the charred remains of what used to be the old chicken coop. His breath was shallow, heart steady. He had learned long ago that fear never helped a man aim straight. The riders came just after moonrise, 3 of them, cloaked in darkness but visible by the glint of steel. They dismounted and approached, confident. Silas stepped forward. "This land's taken," he said coldly. The leader grinned. "We're not after land." Mira stepped onto the porch behind Silas. "You found what you came for. Now leave." One of the men raised his rifle. Silas fired first. Chaos cracked the night. Gunfire echoed through the trees. Luke and Sammy shouted warnings from above. Mira ducked, dragging Clara behind the root cellar wall. The leader returned fire, grazing Silas's shoulder, but not before taking a bullet to the thigh. Within minutes it was over. 2 men dead. The leader wounded and crawling. Silas approached, blood dripping from his arm. "She yours?" the man sneered through gritted teeth. Silas stared down at him. "She's mine like this land's mine. Not owned. Chosen." He aimed, but Mira stepped between them. "No more death," she said, voice shaking but firm. "Let him crawl back and tell them. We're done running." Silas hesitated, then lowered the gun. They watched the man disappear into the woods, broken and humiliated. The next day, Silas rode into town. Alone. He found the blacksmith and quietly spoke to the sheriff. "There's a bounty on someone who saved my life. That bounty's built on lies. I suggest the name disappear, or I won't be so polite next time." The sheriff said nothing. But word spread. And no one came looking again. That spring, Mira planted roses behind the cabin. They bloomed violently red, almost defiant. Sammy built a swing for Clara on the old oak tree. Luke helped Silas dig a second well. And one morning, Mira brought a folded cloth to Silas's hands. Inside was a baby's bonnet. He stared, unsure what to say. "I hadn't told you," she said softly. "Didn't want to until I was certain." He didn't speak. Instead, he reached for her hand and held it against his chest, where his heart still beat stubborn and strong. "Will you stay?" she asked. "I was never planning to leave." Seasons came and went, each carving deeper roots into the land. They buried the past beneath stones and new seeds. The children grew. Silas grew older. And one night, years later, as he sat beside the fire with gray in his beard and the sound of laughter outside, he looked at Mira, her hair streaked with silver, eyes still fierce, and said, "Funny how life finds its way back." She smiled. It never left. It just needed a place to land. Outside, the triplets played, older now but still full of joy. A new child toddled through the grass, his steps unsure but determined. The world had not become easier, but it had become theirs. In the quiet of dusk, Silas stood on the porch and watched the sky turn gold, a rifle beside the door, just in case. Behind him, the sounds of home, clattering dishes, soft humming footsteps on wooden floors. Ahead, the wilderness stretched on, wild and beautiful. But for the first time in his life, Silas didn't feel alone. He had taken in strangers once, desperate, starving, broken. What he didn't know then was that they were the ones who would heal him. Not with grand gestures or spoken vows, but with shared burdens, small kindnesses, and the rebuilding of a life neither he nor they believed possible. The land still whispered at night. But its stories were no longer ones of grief. They were of survival, of found family, of stubborn hope. And in that final moment of twilight, Silas breathed in deeply, the scent of wood smoke and roses filling his lungs. A life remade. A story completed. But never finished,